swiftly as we can to our next session, why global brands are betting big on Africa. And to speak with Rajan on this subject, we're very happy to welcome to the stage Hamza Farooqui, the Chief Executive Officer of Millat Global, Felicity Black-Roberts, Senior Vice President Development for Hyatt, and Warrick Haskell, the Principal Corporate Finance Representative for Nedbank. Welcome, all three.
Okay.
Sorry,
a bit like the last panel.
Side,
I'm going to explain something about in a sense, the relationship, professional, not personal, between these three people, because there is one, and it's an interesting model for us to talk about. But first of all, let's approach this question. Why are global brands betting big on Africa? Number one, is it true from your experience? And number two, why is it? And let me. Oh, and I should explain. We have from here again the perfect combination of people here who are all talking from a different perspective to a certain extent. So we have the developer, we have the financier, and we have the actual operator. So and the brand owner, obviously with Hyatt. I guess they're all part of the same thing. But let's just go to that. Evidence that companies are betting big on Africa. You start, Hamza.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. There's, I think, a couple of things, and I want to take a step back. It's very important for us to take stock of where the macro of the world today sits. Because we say, why are the brands or any of these businesses betting big on Africa? I think it's important to understand that. And I think there's a couple of drivers. One, I think the sort of general consumption of travel is becoming more and more relevant. Today's younger generation is spending more and more on travel, but they're looking for locations, destinations, experiences. Africa provides that. I think people want something new, they want something fresh. I think generally there is this whole drive of the global south. And as that's becoming more and more prevalent, sub-Saharan Africa is becoming relevant. And then I think you've got a very growing young population. If you see the numbers in Europe, they're declining. Yeah. And so all of those factors are creating interest. Now, does it mean everyone is running the way everyone is looking at deploying capital, as an example for AI? Is it the same rush? No, because I don't think there's that level of understanding. There's still a lot of trepidation, but there is definitely interest. And I think the winner is going to be the person who can curate the interest with execution capability and also get it growing. And I think certainly from a Millat standpoint, that's what we are trying to do in a very curated and a thoughtful fashion today.
Because you haven't just operated within the hospitality industry, you've worked in lots of other industries, right? Is it true in other industries that people are drifting towards Africa?
You know, yes and no. I think if you look at an example, we're a large investor in the downstream space, in the retail space, and I think we see those spaces to be very adjacent to our hospitality investment. Because why? It's about the customer, it's about people, it's about building capability. And those are the kind of things we are trying to build. But I think if you look at the downstream business, a lot of the oil majors are getting out.
Right.
But that's leaving huge amounts of void and space for new talent, for traders to come in, and I think that's something we're trying to build capability and sort of, we've just recently announced the opening of Pret in South Africa. Those are all things which create capability, people, confidence, which I think play to that similar playbook on the macro standpoint, but why Africa is becoming very relevant today.
Felicity, from your perspective, obviously Hyatt are investing big or bigger in Africa. And maybe I should explain this now, that all three of you were involved in the development of is that true, of the Cape Town and Johannesburg hotels, or not?
Yes, I mean, Hyatt is the brand and the operator that we work with in South Africa. Nedbank, we have a deep relationship with, but I think they'll speak to that on their own. But yeah, there is a touch point, I think, that sort of both of them have had in the brand and the journey and sort of our important sort of stakeholders in the business and the ecosystem, I think, on the continent.
So Felicity, yes. What's the reason for the greater interest in Africa?
Well, I think Hamza articulated it exceptionally well in terms of the macro piece, in terms of how we see the market in Africa unfolding, and the opportunity not only for tourist experiential travel, which we're seeing much more of a demand for now, and that's kind of where Hyatt itself is also moving slightly to address that demand generation. And also we see an opportunity within Africa much more for MICE business.
Mm-hmm.
Again, taking those groups out to experience something very different. So we kind of see two avenues for us to be able to expand. I think the other important thing to remember from a brand perspective like Hyatt is we need a network effect to make everything sing. And that gets quite complicated because I think on one of the presentations earlier, we saw that one of the key demand markets for Africa is the UK. So not only do we need to be looking at what we're doing in Africa, but we also need to be matching that with a strategy to grow our brand in the markets that are going to provide the incoming tourists or business travellers. So everything's kind of connected. And a lot of what we do is how are we creating that network effect that's for the benefit of the whole.
And explain to us what exactly is the presence of Hyatt in Africa at the moment?
So we have 15 hotels across 8 countries, which if you think about Africa, that's like
Not much.
nothing.
No.
And I think that then comes down to an organisation like Hyatt is, there's a couple of things in this, is firstly we're not using our own balance sheet to grow. We're operating hotels on behalf of organisations like Millat. So we need to find partners who want to grow with us. And in a places where we're not so familiar, having trusted partners is incredibly important to us. And you know, to be able to grow more than one hotel or small portfolio suddenly creates that network effect. So, you know, we can look at our organic growth, which is a hotel here, a hotel there. But again, you've got to be very careful about where you put them in terms of, are we going to put heads into beds in these hotels and really add value as a brand? And then the other part of the equation is can we look at either growing with a partner who's going to do a portfolio over time, or indeed partner with somebody who already has a portfolio to give us that immediate network effect. So there's a couple of factors at play, and I think the other point of mentioning is historically Hyatt hasn't been franchising its brands in Africa.
Yep.
We've got our first franchises operational now in Cairo. Again, a partner who has already got 2 hotels open with us, and we would hope that they're going to open more. So we're again seeking those quality franchisee partnerships because they're sometimes much better able to get onto the ground operationally than perhaps we would be able to.
If you were doing it, right. There's lots to discuss there, which we're going to pursue. Warrick, I know Nedbank's primary market is South Africa, but you do work or you do operate within other countries in the South African region, yeah? What is changing from your perspective, as you know, in terms of investment, in terms of finance, in terms of trust with Africa?
Yeah, it's just look, South Africa and I suppose the SADC region in particular has had slow sort of economic recovery. I think post-COVID has been a bit longer than some of our sort of competing nations in the developing world, but I think it is changing quite rapidly, and we've seen a lot of countries around that region start to develop and start to stabilise a bit. South Africa is obviously projecting a little bit of better growth, and that's obviously from our market quite an important one. But I think if you look at the overall fundamentals, particularly from a tourism perspective, South Africa is still fairly small in relation to other developing markets. There's still a lot of room for growth, and I think the sort of larger brands are definitely seeing it from a sort of growing middle class, very young populations. Touch wood, hopefully everything starts to improve from an economic perspective where there would be more disposable income. I can sort of talk to South Africa in particular. There's a few different levers that are going to start to become more prevalent and allow for disposable income to improve, much like Europe at the moment. hopefully lowering interest rates from a consumer perspective, lowering inflation, a lot more disposable income, and it's very much because we are a young population, there's a lot more, or Gen Z, I think, or Gen Y, as was discussed in the previous panel, there's a lot more experiential services orientation towards the spend. And that's obviously benefits tourism from a
And that influences the decisions that you make from an investment point of view.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we obviously have to look at operators and brands in particular that we can trust and see as being sort of beneficial and have an important thesis. I think Millat and Hyatt and their partnerships, as well as from a Nedbank perspective, who we fund, it's very much a sort of trusted operator, trusted brand. Partnership works very well. And I mean, the research that comes out of both of these organizations is vast, and that helps us as a funder to get very comfortable with it. I think there's been a few ventures in the South African market that haven't been successful, unfortunately, but from a banking perspective, what we're looking for is partners like this who have got access to capital in their own rights, but also ultimately have got the ability to operate these ventures successfully, and makes a big difference in our world.
Because you opened the Hyatt was it Cape Town? During COVID.
Smack bang in the middle of COVID. I still remember running around the corridors with the mask, and I think, the brand told me it's not going to happen. Come back when global supply chain happens. But I knocked on their door and I said, guys, I'm going to do sort of 2 more Hyatt houses. They said, what? We thought this is, most owners do this, right? I'll give you more hotels. I'll do more. But I think that's where there was a very synergistic fit. We had a very strategic rationale, and we want to build scale. We are in this business, I think, and that's where there's a meeting of the minds, right? This is not the one trophy owner type syndrome, and you build it. It's not easy, right? Because Africa is challenging. Our friends at Nedbank are great, and as with any other lenders, there are challenges to sort of access capital in Africa. The risk premium is challenging, but I think if you have the right pieces, you sort of build the right piece, and I think you can curate that story.
I guess we should talk about the challenges because they are still there, some of these long-standing stumbling blocks. Let's bring out the usual ones that are always mentioned. Visa regulations, air connectivity, what else? Fuel costs, things, the usual things that have always hampered progress. Is it improving?
So I think I'm going to look at it very differently, right? For me, the paradigm is going to be people and skills.
Right.
I think money you can solve for, everything else you can solve for. Policy in itself, at some point in time, the politicians are also going to realize they're going to have to stop showboating and get on with it, right? Because otherwise they're also going to be out of jobs. So my view is policy and capital is going to solve for itself. People and the ability to create sustainable and real organizations is where the real metal is. That's how you're going to create scale, because these people are going to want experiential, but they're not going to want experiential with third-tier smile and sort of insincere offerings.
Yeah.
So I think people and skills is going to be very important. I also think, as much as we say there's going to be a lot of technology, AI, and all of those things, I think people are going to want to be welcomed warmly. I think if you look at where that space is, people want that human touch, that human interaction. The reason why Airbnb today is facing the kind of challenges is because I don't just want to walk into a random apartment and not sort of know where my space is. I want people. I want that connection. So I think all of those reasons are going to drive for people to be the biggest challenge. And I think in Africa, that's what's going to be the biggest challenge, but it's also the biggest opportunity. You shouldn't forget, tourism generates 1 in 10 jobs on this earth. We forget that, right? But that's sort of where the relevance of the sector is. And, government, everyone thinks it just automatically comes. One of the brand CEOs says this very well. We are entering a golden age of travel, and I'm firmly of that view. But if we can solve for people, then I think you'll solve for everything.
I mean, I think at the moment, the sector provides, in Africa, employment for 25 million people, 5.6% of the continent's total jobs. Now, that is too small, right? That is going to grow, because that is obviously potential there for fulfilling the potential that continent has. Again, how do we see that happening? People, training. How much can that be improved? I mean, we talked about it a little bit in that first panel, but how much can that affect the way things are?
Well, I think maybe Felicity will speak a bit more to this from a brand
obviously
perspective,
Hyatt
you know,
would do in-house training.
but I think that's the advantage of the brands, right? You know, the brands have huge amounts of insight, knowledge. I mean, we are great. We know South Africa, but you know, when you look at what the brands have, the platforms, you know, tools, you know, such as Hyatt Connect, you obviously need to know how to use those right. And I think that's where there's huge amounts of value, where I think the brands can sort of really grow. And I think you need to know how to tap into that and sort of proliferate that on the right platforms.
So yeah, what is your approach with Hyatt then when you're going into, you send task forces in, don't you? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to step back slightly, you know, whenever I talk to people about a hotel experience, 9 times out of 10, what they will actually cotton on to after I had a great holiday was, and somebody did X or Y or Z for me. So the importance of people to creating brand glow is really, really important. So anything that we do at Hyatt is really around people first, and we have, to Hamza's point, you know, we have the systems, we have the best practice, but at the end of the day, you can have as much online training as you want, but you've got to make sure that the people in the hotel have engaged in that training. And in the first instance, you've got the right people actually in through the door. And I think one of the big issues for the hospitality industry globally, and we see it in Europe as well, is actually attracting people into the industry in the first place. Yeah. And actually people recognizing that hospitality is a great industry to be part of, that it has a level of professionalism and it can create a future career for people. And I think as an industry, we talk about it a lot, but we still don't really get there. And maybe there's a lack of global coordination over this. But we talk about people a lot within Hyatt because actually that's what propels the businesses forward. Yeah. So, you know, yes, when we open a hotel anywhere, we put a task force of Hyatt people in there because it's what's Hyatt's culture? What is it that the person who went to the Hyatt Regency in Birmingham in the UK attracted them to go and choose Hyatt Regency in Africa, for example? And, you know, they want to see that brand promise running through, so we need to train that. But we also need to be aware of the local culture as well, and that's where working with organisations like Millat is really very powerful.
I mean, the other aspect is, when it comes to that, is role models. Do you have local people who are in charge of your hotels rather than just working in the let's call them not menial, is the wrong word, but, you know, in cleaning or in whatever other jobs? Do you have that?
Absolutely, yeah. And then we try as far as we can not to have large expat populations within our hotels. Not only is it hugely expensive, which, you know, hits the GOP, but it's important to make sure that we're growing local talent. That's absolutely critical. And not just role models from a nationality perspective, but also, and I'm very passionate about this, retaining females within the industry. We lose a lot of females in the industry when they drop out, maybe to have children.
During COVID particularly, was a big dropout, wasn't there? Yeah.
Really, really tough. Yep. And, you know, ladies, they go off to have their families. Culturally, it might not be seen right that they then come back to work. And let's face it, we work in an industry where the hours can be punishing, you know, and not conducive to family life, for example. So it's around having HR policies that allow that flexibility to try and retain women within the industry and actually bring more senior women through.
In terms of recruitment, how's it been for you?
We're just about to open the Park Hyatt in Johannesburg. One of the first things we've done is we've said, great, sort of nice boutique hotel, but we need to have a team member facility close by, and we've been spending significant time, resources, because if I don't look after that person, then he doesn't enjoy his cup of coffee, team dining or staff dining in an environment which at least gives them the sense of why, a sense of purpose, a sense of building real empathy. Then I'm not going to get that rate optimization. I'm not going to get that culture. So we've been working very hard at that, and I think a brand like Hyatt helps in that, right? Because I think people, empathy, are very important things they stand for. But you need to know how to curate those elements in the local space for your business. And I think that's what we are working on and working very hard on that.
And what about staff accommodation in the hotels? How central is that to you?
So I think South Africa, very different to the Middle East, where you hire expats and you have to provide them the sort of package. But at some point in time, it's going to be something very relevant, right? Africa, you can't expect staff to go miles away. Some of them don't have access to water, staff laundry, staff meals. These are very important elements, which, for us at Millat, we look at. When I walk into my hotels, I make sure I want to go and see what our associates are eating, because I cannot expect them to deliver the kind of service if they themselves are getting, tick box approach on sort of staff meals. And these are very important things. I once saw a hotel where, the team doesn't have access to milk in their coffee, because why some owner is trying to sort of binge it. That's not the culture which is going to lead to experience quality. And I think if you understand that, if you execute that, then I think all the stakeholders are going to be happy. The customer, the brand, and even the financier who is underwriting the deal, then he's backing a real jockey. And I think those are all very important pieces where the thread then comes together.
We talked earlier on about different types of hotels, Warrick, within Africa. Obviously, there is the resort type hotel, there is the boutique type hotel, there is also the conservation model, the safaris, all that. Do they all, for you, have equal attraction in the future in Africa? Can they all work?
I think so. I mean, it's obviously thesis dependent and operators dependent. I mean, you've seen some of the luxury resorts, call it on safari, that have been extremely successful in their offerings and extremely successful in terms of attracting customer bases. I think from a funding perspective, we're not necessarily focused on a particular style of it. We
Right.
more look at it, I suppose, in terms of the metrics itself and ultimately what's going to be the easiest way to bring customers into the beds. I think one challenge around South Africa and Africa in particular, you mentioned earlier, is around logistics to and from certain locations.
Yeah.
Some of them times it's prohibitive, and ultimately from our perspective, it's important that we can have a constant sort of flow of people into those resorts if they are going to be in outerline areas, and that is always a consideration from our perspective. But it's not necessarily prohibitive either way. In some cases, it can actually be advantageous to be a little bit remote. So from our perspective, we don't necessarily concern ourselves in a particular way. I think it really comes down to how is it ultimately going to wash its face when it comes from a funding perspective, and that's where we do really have to trust in terms of how these operations are set up. I mean, maybe to take it back to one of the reasons why we like partnering with larger groupings and larger brands and sort of local operators is around the staff element to it. A lot of the operators and the Hyatt, I suppose, has done in this in terms of its own training. Then there has to be a upliftment or an upskilling of people around the area and in the hotels, particularly when you get out to the sort of outlying areas. Some of those communities don't necessarily have large employment opportunities. So when looking at these, when it comes down to the metrics around sustainability, around actual people element to it, those are all factors that have to be taken into consideration when looking at it. And if you don't have the right people and you don't uplift the community, sometimes those operations are not necessarily successful. We've seen it in a lot of cases where there has been the sort of fly-in model where you fly in everybody from an international operation somewhere locally, that they haven't necessarily got the buy-in of those that are around them in a community perspective. And that can actually harm, I suppose, the bottom line from a profitability perspective. If you don't have the sort of community around you and the employees sort of motivated, it can actually start to impact the performance.
And of course, let's not forget investors. And traditionally, again, they wanted the highest amount of money for their shares. They want returns.
Yep.
Are they also taking into account a bit more the longer term here, the longer term potential?
Yeah, I think absolutely. South Africa has seen a lot of sort of foreign entrants as well as sort of local transactions where there has been a lot more focus around giving employees a participation within their ventures. So in a lot of cases in South Africa, you have staff share ownership plans that are encouraged
Right.
and sort of looked on favorably from a regulator perspective to see employees actually being able to participate in an upliftment. And it's amazing. It doesn't necessarily involve large percentages of corporates, but that small amount makes people, one, very, very motivated to be at work on a daily basis, and it's incredible to see the success that some of those ventures have had in terms of actual significant value creation for very impoverished areas.
So they become stakeholders,
Yep.
by definition, the employees. The local community, which we touched on again earlier, you've got to have their buy-in now. You've got to have their because I love this phrase, which I kind of made up, and I'm going to keep using it now. Locals don't want to be extras in their own movie anymore.
Yeah,
That's true.
You've got to involve them. And how much, again, are you doing that when you start a new venture?
So I think ownership is, I think, just one matrix, right?
Yep.
The kind of investment in Africa and South Africa owners and capital providers are having to make in skills is significant. So I think probably later on in the cycle, ownership is something which is going to come about in terms of ESOP plans. So in the US, if you see one of the ways that unions and established labor is being dealt with is through these schemes. I think Africa still, because of the kind of investment needed and just skills development. So if you look in South Africa, there's a BE scorecard. One of the big things is skills development. If you're spending money on skills, that sort of is at a higher ranking than even ownership. So I think that's probably where today Africa and South Africa is, because if you don't train these people, if you don't invest in making them more employable, if you don't invest in actually getting them to understand this Kool-Aid, the secret sauce, you're not going to build that ecosystem. But I think definitely in the next 3 to 5 years as a group, as we grow more scale, employee participations and all of those schemes are going to become very relevant and are going to be things that we'll look at. But for now, it's about investing in getting these people skilled, trained up. And look, South Africa still has huge amounts of unbranded inventory. The only way you'll build that destination, that platform, the portfolio effect, the network effect, is by getting the right people in the right space and investing in them. So I think that's probably the call for the day for us.
I mean, going back to what I've heard, and I appreciate that the media, for example, can overblow these things. But, you do have these stories of where you get local farmers, for example, in a sense, resenting the arrival of a new hotel, and more in the rural areas, because they end up competing for resources. I mean, water being one of them. I mean, how do you avoid that kind of conflict? Is that something you're aware of when you bring a hotel into an African situation? Felicity, do you want to go to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from all of our perspectives, from an ESG perspective, that's very high up on Hyatt's agenda in all regards. So, something like that we would be very, very mindful of, and how to engage. And again, it comes down to, we talked about the relationship here between the three organisations. It comes down to those 3 pillars, if you like, of the stool that makes the hotel grow and happen. It comes down to those people working together and really having a shared vision, but also shared values. And it's very easy, that trips off the tongue. We want to share the same values. But actually, I see that more and more in business now, that sharing values is really important. And working with Hamza, we like the fact that he wants to invest in people, because we see the value of that. As an organisation, our kind of statement is we care for people to be their best. So we want to work with people who also align with that. And we want to know that investors are going to be not looking necessarily in a very, very short-term view, but, how do we establish businesses in these locations for the long term? This isn't a short-term perspective.
Sure. I mean, and the other aspect of this, which I'm going to raise, is leakage. The suspicion of all the money, lots of the money goes out of the country. It doesn't stay within the country because it goes to a multinational or it goes to investors somewhere else. Again, are you mindful of that suspicion? Is this something that you come across or not?
I think, look, there is, I think, a quid pro quo here. There is value which I think the brand adds. So certainly from our standpoint, there is something, and I think I'll probably not use the word spin it, but place it. The local operators and brands see it as such. So it's actually not from the consumer. The local brands believe they know it all. And South Africa, unfortunately, that is a big problem because they've had a head start, they've had humorous advantages, and they believe they know it all. So they believe, yeah, but the brands just come in and take a management fee and walk away when we can just do it ourselves. Problem they have today is the need for digital, the need for loyalty, the need to invest in technology. And unfortunately, that's not there. So I may be staying in a local brand hotel in South Africa, but the longevity of my business is getting limited because my hotel is getting old, tired, I'm unable to yield a new customer segment, and unfortunately, if I don't either brand or bring in the right customer segment, my business is dead. So I think that does prevail, and you're right, it does prevail in South Africa, but that's actually from the existing unbranded players who've had this head start and who've sort of narrated the story. Look, the brands have had their own fair challenges, right? I'm not, they haven't cracked the code in most markets, but I think that's changing. There's a new culture. There's a, owners also have to take some responsibility. They have to be more thoughtful, right? You can't just fizz bang and say, I want more money. Yeah. So I think collaboration and having a collaborative intent is much more prevalent today.
Does that apply to the bigger hotel groups and the smaller hotels? Because SMEs are a very important part of the ecosystem, aren't they? They certainly are, by fact, in the hotel industry, in hospitality generally. So what do you think the prospects are for the smaller hotels?
I think their ability to grow up the chain. I mean, if you're a small owner and your desire to grow up is there. I had one hotel when I was 27. It was with another brand. I was a trophy owner and I never did anything else. Today, this is my bread and butter because I've understood the thesis, the sort of strategy. I've made the move from a small owner to sort of sitting in the space today. This didn't come overnight. There were pains, failures, learnings, and sort of so I think definitely for those small owners there is huge scope. But you've got to understand what the thesis is, what the playbook is, and I think execute on it with the right collaborative intent.
Okay, I've just been given the crossing the throat signal, which means that I'm not going to die, but I think unless we're all dying of hunger, which I suspect we might be. So I'm going to have to end it there. I mean, there was so much more I want to talk about because also the things we talk about the big players in terms of which countries. Obviously, we had somebody from Malawi on a previous panel. We should be thinking, I presume, about the future of the other countries and how they can be pushed forward. Maybe that'll be something that we can discuss a bit later on. But for the time being, Felicity, Hamza, Warrick, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.